This is Maxine Doogan with the KPFA Labor Collective. Welcome to International Women's Day 2006 program. We'll be interviewing Maggie De Vrise, author of Missing Sarah, a Vancouver woman remembers her vanished sister. It's a book about her missing sister Sarah, a street-based prostitute in Vancouver, BC, who went missing in 1998. Robert Pickton, a property owner in Vancouver, is now facing 29 counts of murder, and one of those would be for the murder of Sarah De Vrise, Maggie's sister. Thank you for joining us today, Maggie.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Maggie, Sarah was 28 when she went missing in April of 1998, and one of her clients, who was a friend of hers, tried to call in the missing persons report originally for her.
Yes, Sarah had a good friend named Wayne Lang that she had known for a number of years. He tried to file a missing persons report with the Vancouver Police Department, but he wasn't able to. They said that only family members could file missing persons reports. So he called me, and I called 911. I was lucky in that by the time I phoned the police to file the missing persons report, quite a few women cases had been reported, and the police had started at least to accept the reports, whereas before that they had often refused to accept missing persons reports in the cases of the missing women. Some family members who had called the police department directly were told to call back in a month, or told to file in their own town, or told that don't be ridiculous, your daughter, sister, mother isn't missing, she's just gone off somewhere like prostitutes do.
So it was if the police didn't want to hear about the missing women, that the missing women were members of society. Sarah had frequent contact with you and your mother and other family members, so it was unlike her to not be heard from.
It was absolutely unlike Sarah not to be heard from. She was in touch regularly with Wayne. She kept in touch with me, with my mother. She wanted to know what was happening in her children's lives. She was in touch with all the people in particular that she lived among, the people she lived with, the people she saw every day. She was part of a community, and she was very deeply rooted in that community, in many ways more than I am in mine. I think partly being a user of drugs kept her even more rooted in her community, because she had made life work for her there, but the rest of the world wasn't very welcoming to her. So I knew that she wasn't transient, which was the word that we heard over and over again. And as I got to know other families of the other missing women, I learned that the stories about them were the same, that they were being told that their loved one was transient and could have just gone off somewhere, but they knew that their loved one was not, and in many cases heard from their sister or their daughter weekly or even daily. I know one woman who talked to her sister every day, and then one day those calls just stopped. And so she knew that something terrible had happened.
So everybody was telling the police that the women were missing, that the women were primarily street-based prostitutes. Some of the women were drug users, and so that was the basis upon which the police didn't want to take seriously these missing person reports?
I think that the police held exactly the same set of beliefs that our society as a whole holds. The police are a reflection of us. They're an institution within our society, and so they believed, like many of us in our society, that people living like my sister was living are not reliable, are not part of any kind of a system, of a structure, are moving all the time, and also that they don't really matter.
But Sarah worked at the same corner at Princess and Hastings Street for years.
Yes, she did. Sarah worked at the corner of Princess and Hastings for many years, and everybody that I talked to, including many police officers, remember her at that corner. And she had been downtown in Vancouver for half her life, the first part in a wealthy part of the city, and then gradually sex workers were pushed further and further out until they ended up way down in the downtown east side where Sarah had always vowed that she would never go. And she'd been in that area for the last 8 or 9 years of her life. And in the early years when she was in her later teens, she did go to Calgary and she went to Seattle and she moved around and spent time in different places. But as she got older, more a part of her community and more rooted there, I think.
Well, yes, sex industry workers, like many other different industries, can be migrant workers.
Yes.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that we're transients.
No, it doesn't at all. It's a word that's used for certain groups of people. If I move and live in one city and then I move and live in another city and then I move and live in another city, nobody's going to call me transient. A way of drawing distinctions, kind of false distinctions among people.
We had talked about Sylvia, the last woman to have seen Sarah alive.
Yes, sometime after Wayne went to find Sarah and couldn't find her, and after we filed the missing persons report, as he talked to more and more people, he found that she had spent that last evening with a friend named Sylvia. They had spent the early evening together in a hotel room and then had gone out to work, and were working on the corner of Princess and Hastings, kitty corner from each other. And Sylvia was picked up by someone but couldn't come to terms with them, and so circled the block and ended up back at that corner very, very quickly. And by the time she got back, Sarah was gone. So it seemed as if Sarah must have gotten into a car in that time. And it also seemed, because there was so little time, as if there was some likelihood that she knew the person who stopped, because she would have been taken more time before she would get into a car with strangers. But of course, all of that is speculation.
So that was in April of 1998.
That's right.
So I know that things slowly started to unfold when you started to form a memorial for all the missing women.
Yes, in the fall of '98, I was finding it very difficult to cope with Sarah's disappearance. I didn't know. I had gone with Wayne and put up posters. I had talked to media. I just didn't know what to do, and I had had 2 close friends die that summer, had attended their memorial service, and I had really faced death, I think, for the first time in my life, close up, and was devastated by it. But the contrast between what I had experienced with my friend's death and with Sarah's disappearance was so stark, because even though my friend's death was terribly tragic, we were with her, we had a memorial, we grieved, we knew what to do and how to feel and how to move forward. With Sarah, she was just gone. She was just gone, and we didn't know anything. And so I was talking to my mother and weeping on the phone. My mother said, well, why don't we have a memorial for Sarah? And then she said, no, why don't we have a memorial for all of the women who are missing? And we should have it on Sarah's birthday, which was May 12th. So that was what we did, and that meant that I got to know lots of the families of the other missing women, and that was a wonderful experience for me to connect with those people, because their experience and mine was so similar, and we could support each other, whereas the memorial had an important personal function, but it also was very important from a public standpoint, because we all wanted people to remember our loved ones and to think of them as human beings, as obviously they were, instead of as the set of stereotypes that they're so often reduced to. And we felt that that was important just in and of itself, but also it was important in order to spur the investigation, because as long as society thinks that sex workers, especially street-based sex workers, are subhuman, then not very much is done to stop violence against them.
And this is Maxine Doogan with the KPFA Labor Collective's International Women's Day 2006 edition, and we're speaking with Maggie De Vrise, who is the author of Missing Sarah, A Vancouver Woman Remembers Her Vanished Sister. Sarah disappeared from Vancouver, BC streets in 1998. Maggie, when did the investigation finally get going?
The investigation got going in different fits and starts, I would say. When Sarah went missing, there was one detective on the cases. And I'm sure he was well-meaning, but it was too much for one person to do. That summer, they assigned a second detective to the cases, Detective Laurie Schenner, and I have great respect for her. I got to know her quite well, and I saw her dedication, and I saw her effort. But she, again, was one person, and together they were just two people. And they weren't experienced in homicide, and they didn't have the resources behind them to help them find out what had happened. So,
well, also there was the issue that they were dealing with criminalized occupation, prostitution, street-based prostitution, and some of the workers were drug users. So there wasn't a lot of trust or information coming from the community from which Sarah was a part of and abducted from.
my sister every day was selling sex to make money, and every day was buying and using heroin and cocaine, and she was committing a crime. The job of the police is to stop her from doing that, but the job of the police is also to protect her if she experiences violence or any of the criminal acts against her. That it's impossible for her to turn to the police for help when those things happen because of the way society has criminalized her behavior, and the police then don't respond in a helpful way. She wrote a long piece that I quote in Missing Sarah about where she was taken out of Vancouver by a client, and, well, not by a client, by a violent criminal, and beaten. And he had the intention of killing her, and she finally escaped from him, but she had hardly any clothes on and no shoes, and she hid in the bushes for a long time until he went away, and then she had to make her way back into the city, and she stopped in a police station to ask for help, and she was just told to get out. And she was beaten and hardly clothed, not really clothed, and she had to hitchhike to get into Vancouver, and the first person who picked her up tried to assault her. And so she got out of that vehicle and was picked up by a man who did help her and took her back home, and she survived, but no thanks to the powers that be.
Yes, we reported on our last International Women's Day program about the serial rapist here in Oakland, and how many of the escorts who went to his house who were assaulted were unable to go to the police to report these assaults. So
yes,
that universal international women's issue.
Yes, it is, and it's a very, very important one.
So, Maggie, can you tell us about, in the spring of 1999, there were a series of garage robberies that happened in the wealthier parts of the city, and that the mayor decided to put up a $100,000 reward for these garage robberies, and how that contrasted to what efforts were being made to get information about the disappearance of the women.
Yes, in the spring of 1999, there were a series of robberies in the west side of Vancouver, in the wealthier part of the city, where someone would follow people into their garages and hold them up for their wallets, and it was frightening for people in that part of the city, and they were very, very upset about it and wanted something to be done, and the mayor decided to offer a $100,000 reward for information leading to the conviction of whoever was responsible for those garage robberies. When asked what efforts were being made to find what had happened to the missing women, he said, "We are not operating a locating service." And the juxtaposition of that rather large effort to find whoever was committing these robberies that did not involve any physical hurt to anyone, unwillingness to do anything, apparently, to find this large group of women who were gone, was impossible for me and for many others to bear. I also thought that the head of our city was telling the citizens of our city that the women were just gone somewhere, that they were fine, they had simply relocated, and the police were not going to waste their time finding out where they had relocated to. And he was sending a message that would work against any investigation, because as long as the population isn't afraid, there's no pressure on the police to solve the crimes, and nothing then, or not very much, is done. For me, there's a strong comparison with the murders that happened in Ontario by Paul Bernardo, the late 80s. I was living in Ontario at the time, and Ontario, the whole province, was terrorized because the rapes were happening, terribly violent things were happening, and they were happening to young women who were in the center of society, women who were teenagers who were living at home and in high school, and everybody was afraid that it was going to be their daughter or them next. Eventually he was caught and convicted, and there are parallels between him and the murderer in the cases of the missing women here. The fact that women were disappearing from the downtown eastside in Vancouver didn't make the rest of society afraid, because nobody thought, oh, now it's going to be me next, except for women in that community. And so it didn't create that society-wide fear. And Philip Campbell, with his comments, was reinforcing that. We don't need to worry. It's just something that those women over there are doing.
So, Maggie, you and other family members were contacted finally in 2002 for DNA samples.
The families were called together for the first time in June of 1999, right at the same time that they put out the poster that America's Most Wanted came to Vancouver, and the poster was presented of the missing woman, and with offering the $100,000 reward. Then in 2002, when they had started searching the property in Port Coquitlam and finding DNA there, they needed DNA samples from families, and so they came to the families for DNA, and they identify the sample that they had found on the property in Port Coquitlam.
So Sarah's DNA is now part of one of the 29 murder charges against Robert Pickton in Vancouver, BC, and that trial is just getting underway now.
Yes, there's now a murder charge in her case, and they have her DNA, and they're in the early stages. The real trial won't start till the fall.
I know that at one point there was frustration with trying to mobilize the police department to take seriously the missing, while the majority of women were actually going missing.
Yes, all the way along from when Sarah went missing in April 98, and many women had gone missing before Sarah did too. But for me personally, that's a point of departure because she's my sister. Women continued to disappear all the way right up to the end of 2001. And even after the Vancouver police had joined together with the RCMP and formed a review team and started going back through all the evidence, women continued to disappear from the downtown east side. And the DNA of many of those women who disappeared in 2001 was found on Robert Pickton's property. So the police were not able to stop it from happening. They just couldn't make it stop. It continued right up until they started searching the property and arrested Robert Pickton.
But there were several other women who are still listed as missing.
Yes, more than 60 women on the list, and there are murder charges in 29, so in fewer than half of those cases are there murder charges.
So Maggie, tell us about your book, Missing Sarah.
Missing Sarah is a book that I wrote in collaboration, in a way, with my sister. Sarah left journals and poetry and art and letters and many, many people who loved her and who had amazing memories of her. I decided to write the book because I thought that Sarah had something to say that people needed to hear, and that I had something to share because of everything that I had been through and everything that I had learned since Sarah went missing. And because it seemed to me that there's so much media coverage of this story, and stories like this are focused on the gruesome side of things and on stereotyping, and they don't really show you who the women were. And I felt that because of the stereotypes and assumptions that we as a society hold about sex work and sex workers, that we particularly need to see human beings in these cases. And so I thought I would give it a shot and try to write a book that would share, and it was published in 2003. It's been helpful for me. I talk to media quite a lot, or I did. I still do to some extent. And I go out and speak quite a lot. But it's impossible to present or share a person in 2 minutes or 1 minute or even in half an hour. And yet in a book, you can share quite a lot. So knowing that people can go and read about Sarah and find out more makes me feel better about very small little bits that get presented here and there.